a wonderful conversation on speeding up social change.
Welcome everybody. Alan Kay, a change facilitator for 20 odd years using Solutionfocused, fully recovered advertising guy, and don't hold that against me. And a couple of years ago, I was doing some work on a volunteer basis with, you can see the picture of the lady in the white there, Mariela Castro, a daughter of Raul. And she was here in Canada at the invitation of the lady sitting close to her sister, Sylvia, who was actually born in Cuba but raised in the US and then Canada. And what she had organized was for Mariela to come to Toronto to talk to LGBT groups of various stripes, health, education, religion, etc., families. So a lot of diversity in the types of groups within the LGBTQ community. And there's the folks at the bottom who appeared at this particular roundtable that we did, who were corporations and government. And of course, most of the people there were in charge of things like diversity, etc. It's a really good session. And I asked the group towards the end of the discussion, I said, listen, I've been in Canada for 30 odd years. And when I came here first, I was shocked, surprised that we were still locking up people for going to bathhouses. And look at it, where it is today. Mariela Castro's come to this country to learn what we do well. How did we do that? And one person jumped up, almost jumped up. Where are we going here? And if you read the words in the circles, I took them down and maybe modified them tiny bit. But you need activism to vigorously bring about political or social change. You need that to get the voice of the change out. You got to fairly quickly move to advocacy or act on the process of influencing change. And then you go to regulation, policy, strategy, culture, whatever it is that's going to send a message to people that things have changed. Not that they're going to, they have. And then you need tactics and implementation plus learning for making it work. The people in that room that day were a clear example of it, that all these large organizations and government had people specifically doing this work. And then she said what I thought was the most brilliant one: you have to socialize it. You have to not assume that what you've learned and it's going to change is going to happen automatically. And she said, for example, in our bank, we've long had gender neutral washrooms. We kind of moved away from them because we don't need them. But in that time when we were launching, and if we built a new building in a rural area of Canada and put in a gender neutral washroom, there would be protests. And whose fault was that? It was ours. We didn't socialize the change with people who weren't used to it. And I think that's a phenomenal insight. Anyway, what I'd like to share with you, and I'd just like to get a few thoughts from you first, is, again, this is not my thinking. This is blurted out by a person in a roundtable. The language, the framework. Cristina, ask a better question.
You know what, I would bet with you that if what comes to my mind, and I think that's the same thing that comes to a lot of people, especially if you are involved in any kind of NGOs, is, and I'm now speaking from two directions, one being a president of one, so we're trying to make a change, so from inside, and in the same time working as a coach with a different NGO and allowing them to put together what is it that they want to try to do as a change.
Yep.
If you go in there and you just try to make them think about how would that change look like, so like asking the straightforward question in the sense of, imagine that now everything is the way you want to be, so how would that look like, and what would you see and what would you notice?
Yep.
The first reaction is that they find it extremely difficult to tell you that. They find it extremely difficult to put that in words, because they just see it from inside them. They see this, you know, if you want to use a metaphor, I think it's like every time when we're trying to make a change, is like you have a fire that you know that is burning inside, you know, that you see it yourself, you can for yourself somehow contain it, but putting it and taking it out and putting it on the ground and say, I'm going to distance myself from it, and I'm going to look at it, and I'm going to try to put a shape to it and a form and a feeling and everything that comes along with that to describe it, and then allow everyone to understand that description, is the stage that gets left behind. And as I said, I see that also from inside, and I see it also from the outside. And I think that's exactly that step of socializing it, by saying, look, I take it out of me, I put it here on the ground, and let's all look at it. Let's all figure it out, how this should be shaping. How would it be? How does it smell? Maybe what's the flavor? What's the color? And what does it mean for everyone? And by just, putting it slowly out there for a second and taking it back and just going back again to say, okay, this is a different group. Maybe you haven't heard about it, but see, that's what I have, and it's going to take a different shape at some point, but just allowing to take a form and a shape slowly. I think that's this beautiful concept of socializing it.
And every social group is different. And some don't need to be doing the first 2 or 3. I mean, I have a client in the mental health area where we went out and did the interviews about activisms and advocacy and even regulation. And when we got back, the ED said, we're doing all that stuff already. We don't need to put it in the strategy. We're very distracting. What we need to do is figure out more tactics, more implementation, and more learning on behalf of our members. So it's not about you have to start from ground zero every time. A different way of thinking about things.
Sure.
If I could go on, so below the circles, it says de-silo people in systems, change practices. Blech. What's nice about de-siloing is certainly lots of organizations, business organizations, are very conscious of the need to de-silo in order to get departments working together. In this case, on a social thing, is how do you de-silo all the different elements of people trying to bring about change and the systems changes. So what I did was I broke it into each column, and I, being solution focused, said what we don't want to avoid activism. Sometimes the activism is a bit jarring, it's too hard. No, we want people to come to a clearer understanding there is a problem. You speed it up by fearlessly amplifying critical issues, grow broader awareness, and initiate innovation. If you don't want to do that, you get stuck. You become binary. There's only one way to do it, prefer to be right, and blaming. Advocacy.
I'm going to say, if we just take a stop at exactly at activism, and I would just turn it also towards everyone that's joined us for this session right now. And I would ask, is anyone willing to share a moment when you try to change something?
Yeah.
And take a look from that perspective also at this step of this step of activism. So anyone willing to share? I understand that you don't want to put your camera on, but you can put your mics on at any moment and share. So we apply the 6-second rule. If there's no one.
There's a big difference in the word advocacy. You've done your activism to get awareness. Advocacy is the start of the planning process, influencing change. You're still demanding change, but you're starting to listen to other people. So you speed it up by listening, clarifying, what do we want to change? We can't change everything. What is it? What already works? How do we engage and understand stakeholder views? And how do we begin to lobby? I use my favorite solution focus line. If you want to get stuck, you insist and you become resistant. Any observations on that one, Cristina?
I would ask first of all if I would check first of all if there are any observation from everyone else. We have also Nick joining us. And what I have from my side is I realize that this sounds very familiar to a situation that I've seen in practice, like exactly that point where you're saying engage and understand stakeholder. Because, you know, everyone thinks of this stakeholder views or doing a stakeholder analysis. It sounds very business and it sounds very, I don't know, the word that comes to my mind is fancy, you know, sounds very something very difficult to do. But actually your stakeholders are, it's not that difficult to take a look at them, and it's not that difficult to just make a simple list and put them together and say, so who actually has an interest in what I'm doing here, and or who do I have an impact, or who can have an impact on me, and just construct what is your environment. Because by just doing that, you have a chance of actually knowing where do you produce a change and how do you want to start producing that change.
And how you do it matters, as I call it. It's not consultancy, although that happens. It's as good a word as any, but the preference for me is co-creation.
Yeah.
You begin the process of communication between the different groups, thinking about we're co-creating as opposed to laying out our grievances.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's the moment when you actually start, you know, there's I just finished reading a book the last week, and that is Weird from Olga Kazan. I hope that I don't get the name wrong, but it's called Weird, I know for sure. And she's talking in there about an interesting concept that it's called behavior credits, if I hope that I remember correctly the terminology that she's using. And it's again linked with being weird doesn't necessarily mean that you have a particular, you know, characteristic, physical or any kind of way, but it's about being also different in that environment. And I think that when you're trying to make a social change, is exactly that. You're being weird, you're being different in an environment that looks at you and sees that differences. And what she's trying to say is, with this credits, is you're joining, first of all, the environment, and you're trying to behave within those norms. So you build up credit by showing, yeah, I'm part of it. I don't, you know, you don't have to be scared about any differences that I might have. And by building, first of all, at the beginning, those credits. So engaging with your stakeholders, like you're saying here, and looking at what is it, how do they perceive and who they are, and starting that conversation or co-creating. After that, the moment when you start diverging and showing what is it exactly the change that you're trying to achieve, you're starting to use those credits. And it's not from the beginning a big impact on the perception that they have on you. It's like you're completely different, but they perceive you at the beginning as part of it, and after that it's easier for you to also socialize that change, because you're showing it, you know, I'm still part of it, but look what we could incorporate.
So regulation, policy, strategy, or culture, you collaborate, negotiate, enable, and enact. This one can take a long time in this respect of, particularly when you want to go in and change government regulations and so on. And I have an organization for whom I've not actually done any work, but they're focused on the rights of children coming out of the foster care system in Canada and Ontario. And the sad part is that the kids have all kinds of different experiences inside the system. On the day that they're 18 years of age, they pop out of the system and they've got no support. And so getting support isn't just a matter of funding and stuff. It takes a lot of work, and there's lots of kids. And so they've been working with the Ontario government for a couple of years now, and they've been through various levels of changing the regulation. What they've discovered recently is that their work has been noticed in other areas, education. And so they've got some colleges, as a result of this work that they've been doing, now offering to take kids out of the foster care system into courses as soon as they turn 18 or close to when the year begins. So the point is, you work hard on this stuff and other good stuff happens. It doesn't happen all at once, but the fact is you're doing it consciously and it helps.
This reminds me of another thing. There is an organization that is called Coaching for Educators. Behind it is Martin Richards, and he's hope would be to just kind of like bring coaching also to teachers and to the ones that are enabling the learning. So the educators in any kind of level and grade in the education system they are. And I was talking to him about how did he make it to convince the Swedish government to give him financing, again, change a policy to allow financing for coaching in schools for educators. And the beautiful thing was he kept on knocking in all of the doors, and like, it reminds me also of the session before about the language, because as soon as you start using a language that for them it has no meaning, they don't understand it, they don't know what it is, and you start by talking about coaching and nobody knows what is it and why it has a relation to educators, you run into a wall. So as soon as he started that discussion and using the proper language and allowing for that negotiation, like you're saying there, and allowing for a change in words also, because he stopped using, for example, we should change the system, we should change the way educators are being supported. He just used, how about we modify? So it's a subtle difference in the words, but it has a big impact. And as you said, I think the work on changing a policy and a regulation, it's a very long-term project that you are embarking on. And as soon as you make it with words that they don't sound that threatening, like change, but it's just about modifying, which sounds more easy, you have a chance to being heard earlier in the process.
The tactics implementation and learning, what this person said was the first two, strategy, tactics, and implementation are relatively easy. The trick is to, first of all, you want to do some measurement, but you particularly want to make sure that you're learning from what you've been doing and its impact, its outcomes, particularly with whoever the users are. For example, again, that case of the kids who come out the foster care system, and it's a lot of them end up in jail, drug addicts, etc., because they've got no emotional connection, etc. So there's a lot of work to be done. You want to measure not just the fact that you're getting them into colleges for free, but what's happening with it. So learning coming from your new practices. And I think the thing that says down there, get stuck, assume it's happening. Hey, we're done, we're done, we've achieved it. No, there's a lot more work to be done. And then finally, as it says down there, solution-focused thoughts, change happens all the time. For some, it's gradual.
What I will pick up out of this section is, you said it very, very, very nicely, and you mentioned broadly among all stakeholders.
Yeah.
And this definitely implies that you have to go through the step of understanding what are your stakeholders.
Yeah.
Because we had it also at the beginning, and we're talking about difficulty of analyzing and seeing what is the value of gathering all of those stakeholders. And I think by putting it here and saying that's the moment when you definitely need them, because you have to socialize them, as they're the ones that have to go through the change. And as soon as you know who they are, they also know how to help them socialize with the change.
And in the last session we had Becky from Texas, a woman who still meets an awful lot of resistance. On the one hand, the forces of resistance are pretty considerable. On the other hand, once you've got the legislation empowering gay people to lead a free life, you do need to think more about how you're going to pitch it to other people, because there are going to be entrenched values, the religious, etc., etc. I don't know if you run a television campaign, but you do have to think again. We've got the legislation, we're free to do this, done. No, you got more work to do.
Do you have an example on this one?
I think it happens all the time. Becky would be an example of it. Gay people in Texas, still a huge amount of resistance to accepting that. And it's a much bigger issue of US culture and politics, etc. I can't think of a micro one right now, but sure, if I dug in, I'd find one.
Because what I take out of what you're just saying is there's actually a multiple or a multi-layer of socializing.
Yeah.
Because there's one thing to say, that's the big picture, so we have the change in legislation or whatever that is, but that doesn't mean that at the granular level in all of the communities that change got accepted. And the question also, the next layer is, okay, fine, then we integrate it in some communities or in some regions. How do we make sure that it's on all of the regions integrated or socialized to this change? But then comes also the question, would this be something that should be translated also in other languages, cultures, regions, countries, continents? So yeah. This is why I think it's definitely a multi-layered.
I think the larger social justice issues, they get a lot of support, and they do go beyond the legislation being approved. I think it's a need for them to figure out what their new job is, not just providing, I don't know, comfort or whatever, but to, if nothing else, spread the message, to socialize the change. So the focus of what they're doing has to move on. So the other point I made was that de-silo people and systems change practices. A lot of social justice has silos of this and that. Government has silos, etc., etc. What we're trying to do through particularly the advocacy and so on is getting those silos to pay attention to each other. And then think about system change practices. To that point, I say there's many new existing and new approaches and tools to help speed up people and systems change. Solutionfocused, a friend of mine has a book on the kitchen table conversation that's quite well respected. ProSci, they're the change management people, but they've got a system. Agile, this morning, who was it? One of the folks was talking about design thinking. You know, somebody might say, design thinking and gay rights, what are you talking about? No, stop it. There's plenty of processes for speeding up this change. Don't just leave it as a, you know, nature will look after it. So I say this from an organizational perspective, that I think a lot, and not-for-profits in particular, could take advantage of some of this learning and apply it to their processes.
You know what I see there? I see a parallel from our previous discussion when we were talking about taking questions out of therapy, out of coaching, so solution-focused questions, and moving them into a corporate environment, because that was the conversation that you were having with Richard. Which is the same thing, saying, well, to the parallel of it, saying that a lot of tools in corporate world, that they should not stay only in the corporate world, but they should be moving also in NGOs.
Yeah, and so that point I made earlier on about you've got the legislation and the association for the rights of whatever, disabled, etc., think that their job is just to produce some programs. No, it's not. It's managing change, using tools that they can easily learn from organizations. Guess what? You partner with organizations. That room was full of banks and government people who partner with lots of not-for-profits. Because not only do they get a warm feeling in their tummy working with the gay rights advocates or whatever. Many of their own staff are gay. You know, it's value going both ways, and therefore help the not-for-profits and associations learn new techniques, new approaches that are, of course, ideally solution-focused to increase their effectiveness.
Mm. And this is that's one example of what's been going on in Germany for a couple of years now. There's a program that is called Start Social, and what happens actually is that NGOs can submit kind of like submit their that change that they want to see happening. You know, they have to put in a pitch that says, this is why you should support me. And they'll get 100 association get selected, and they don't receive anything else besides support from a coach. So it's not like they get any kind of money, but they obviously, the bigger impact is that you get drawn into a pool of other NGOs, that you get this conversation going, that you get people to exchange your ideas with, to figure it out how others figure it out. And in the same time, behind the entire program, on one side there's the German state, but on the other side you have great organizations like or big organizations like McKinsey. And what they're doing is taking out of these corporate tools simple ideas and saying, look, we come together one time in this program and we present to you tools that they sound like truly and purely corporate world, but that's things that you should be doing also in your organization, even if you're just an NGO, but you should be considering those things and having them implementing and scaled to the level of your organization and to the impact that you want to have.
Absolutely. And the issue is, and I mean, I've been going on about this for years, the boards of these not-for-profits are only interested in what I call program and budget. Of late, they've become interested in the quality of the management of the organization, not just the programs and the budget. And by bringing in the corporations, the partners in the corporation, this stuff drifts not just into the board, but into the management of the organization, so that they're developing their people to operate better, etc., and look beyond programs.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's the moment when you have even a bigger change, because those people that you, so to say, train by just being in an NGO, they develop the skills that they can move and have an even bigger impact, because even if they transition to another organization, to another corporate, in the corporate world or wherever they go, they will still remain the advocates of that NGO. So they're going to spread the word even more and even further, because they will join other organizations where they, you know, spread the word, and then it's just every drop counts.
Yep. I was doing a roundtable this morning for a not-for-profit, and the big thing in the not-for-profit is understanding what the culture is, not just the programs. And increasingly funders and partners are starting to say, we need to improve the quality of the culture here, starting with the way things are managed. A couple of quick slides that showing, as I said before, you don't have to think that this is the automatic flow of things. The one I cited was they realized they're well down the path, they're very well established. It's mental health for artists. And they got great programs, so much so that they're being copied in other parts of the country. But their issue is, and they're building this, it's very, very interesting to see how to socialize it through their members. You know, some of their members have got pretty serious mental health issues, but they're a really good artist, or they're a really good cinematographer or whatever. And helping the members socialize the change by running events in which the public's invited in to look at the work and all this kind of stuff. There's just so much going on under the surface that we can think about. The other one is, you know, the beginning of that their activism to policy. Some stuff you can do quite quickly, particularly if it's a real crisis. Don't assume this is going to take 5 years.
Alan, I would say, should we just pause again for a second and ask if there are any questions, any ideas, any feedback, any comments? We'll take all of them and just use them.
How about this question? How would you see yourself speeding up social change? Should we pick on somebody to answer?
I know Nick has been up all night until now watching Europe sessions. So
our Antipodean, our Aussie friend.
I slept a little earlier, a couple of hours.
And some good strong coffee.
And I've just went down and got some fresh coffee.
So, thinking about this concept, Nick, what my usual line? What impresses you most about it? What would you see organizations doing to begin to think like this?
I'm completely a novice when it comes to organizational change. And I'm looking at this stuff with new eyes. So I'm completely naive when it comes to that. I'm very impressed by what you're doing.
This is how Australians get out of making a comment.
Yeah. Oh well, Kiwis. We're not. I'm not an Australian. You know, I'm a Kiwi.
You're Kiwi. Yes.
Oh yeah. Oh, you know, world of difference. You know, it's confusing. You know, you with being an American. You know, and you're Canadian. You know.
Exactly. Plus, you've got the world's greatest woman prime minister.
Yeah. We probably have. Yeah.
But Alan, look, that we have Kevin wrote something in the chat. Your question, and that is lead by example. Position yourself into the situation or scenario, and how you might embrace the change.
Yeah, I think it's important for people to, how can I put it, zoom out of the nasty situations you're trying to make better, look down on it and think this way, not necessarily in the order that's shown, but what are these, how are we going to attach, how are we going to deal and use these opportunities that will work for our community? Look down instead of, being on the ground, trying to figure out the next program.
True, and I think that also helps to just go back when you're zooming out. It allows you also to reconnect and reconnect first of all with all of your stakeholders, because it allows you to take another look from the bird's view and see what is it exactly that they need now. Because as you said, everything is in a continuous change.
Yep.
Any other ideas from anyone else in the room? I mean, we're small enough to have an open conversation.
Sometimes you've achieved a lot in a much shorter time than you expected, so nobody wants to go off to another session.
Brian just wrote, build alliances.
Yeah.
How have you seen this in action?
Me? Well, again, this organization I'm working with this morning, they do local arts communities, and they don't have property. They meet in church basements and stuff. They've got a good reputation at the community level. It's hard to run it because it's all field and everybody's doing different things. We've talked to funders and a few other people, and they've all said the same thing: partnerships, build alliances, go into the other local arts communities who may not be dealing with the situation the way they are, see what they got in common. Technology has a huge impact on the arts these days. and particularly the way they're doing this community stuff. Not everybody's got a computer. So find a computer retailer or something like that. Build alliances instead of just going for more money from the funders. Work with people who can provide you services that are a benefit to them as well as the community you're working with. And one of the interesting ones that came out yesterday was how do you develop your people by building partnerships with organizations that are good at developing their people, you know, HR and so on, to help get them to help you with your people. You don't have to do it all yourself.
True. You know what else comes to my mind? I think that there are two directions that you have to take a look when you're talking about building alliances. I think that alliances that are with the ones that are your own kind.
Yeah.
So like similar associations, similar organizations, similar NGOs or for-profit, doesn't matter, but you're building within that area. And in the same time, you have to also figure it out how you can be complementary to something else.
Yep.
How can you become like, you know, I go back to the corporate world where you call a bundle and you take two products that you put them together and you sell them as those two products together, the same thing. How do you get yourself with another company, NGO or anything that you can? And I don't think it's about figure writing, it's about positioning yourself with an organization next to an organization that has the same values and the same desire to activate a change.
Yeah. And
that allows you to achieve from two directions this kind of socializing by showing, you know, that's not only I'm sticking to my own kind. And I think this is also linked to the first stage that you had in there, where you become binary and you're saying I'm just sticking to my own kind, because then I do see only the change how I want it, and I just put aside everything else because I don't want to see that they don't want to change. But if you attach yourself to somebody that is complementary to you, then it forces also to look at it from a different perspective.
Yep. What are we doing about sharing slides? I'm happy to share this lot. We're not putting them into the chat box, right?
I think that might be difficult, and I think that we should make it available to everyone. Our desire would be to create a repository with everything. At least the videos would be, the first step would be to have everything on YouTube.
Right.
I don't know what's the best way of going forward also with the slides. I think we can also upload them. The slides is very easy to upload them on the website and make on the website a section where you can download the presentations. And I think, yeah, that might be probably the fastest and easiest way for the moment, and then have a bigger solution. But I'll definitely say that as soon as we have it worked out, everyone gets an email on that email account that they register on Eventbrite with the link or whatever the description of the solution that we found is.
Good.
But any other questions? I don't know, any other ideas, any other suggestions, comments? We still have another 15 minutes that, as I said, we're a small enough group that we can debate freely. And I'm more than sure that you second me, Alan, if I say, I really love when people says, well, I don't really see it that way. How about this lenses? Or how about looking at it from this perspective?
Sorry, say that again.
I was saying that I don't mind having a nice debate also on a different perspective. If somebody has a different perspective from what we've tried to talk about with socializing the change, but saying, you know, you just have to, for example, you just have to keep it to your own kind, and that's it. So that's also a perspective.
Yeah, disagreement's important. As I always say at my roundtables, we turn disagreement into dialogue. But if we don't have disagreement, why are we doing the round table? We've got so many different perspectives. So anybody disagree with the presentation?
Anyone that disagrees? Anyone that has something else that they want to ask or comment?
Yeah, I will comment this is the second or third session I've been to of yours. The reason I came to your sessions,
yeah,
is I'm interested in developing a grammar of SFT, a broader grammar than the grammar for therapy. Grammar being the Wittgensteinian sense of the use of rules. Like chess has a particular set of moves, and that's its grammar. That could be said to be its grammar. Now, and it's what makes it recognizable as a solution focused is its grammar. You know, and we have scaling questions, preferred future, those sort of things are within the grammar.
Yep.
And I went to all your sessions because I'm very interested in developing this notion across different environments where SF is appearing these days. There's a common grammar, and I'm interested in extracting that or distilling that.
It's a very interesting point, because on the one hand, my pitch is, particularly in the previous presentation, that we're using solution-focused language in order to listen to what the client wants, and the language they use is what we work with. And that's when you're working with 200 people in an organization, it's going to be a combination of their language. And the other point is, of course, the folks in the finance department have a different language from the people in IT who have different, in sales and so on. So you're trying to break down the language barriers. I've actually done that work with ING Bank in Belgium, where HR was not listening to the bankers. The bankers were going crazy. So we taught the HR people some ways to listen to the language of the other departments. Tell me a little bit more about your distinction in the word grammar, because
Wittgenstein says that we have a grammar of color. Like that, what we're doing is that we understand color from its grammar, and he provides that as a model. He has there's a diagram which is a color thing. It's a diagram of all the colors. It has black and white at the apex and the two points, and then the four primary colors. Then the mixtures all come in between, and that explains color perfectly. It becomes a paradigm that we get all our colors, all of our grammar of color. But I say chess is an example of what he means by a grammar, because it's the rules of the game. And if you make a move, that if you move the knight like a queen, you get pulled up on it straight away, because you're not, following the rules. Now it's a similar sort of thing. There's an emerging solution-focused language or grammar that's emerging here, and going across, coming out of therapy and looking at this broader application. I'm beginning to get a glimpse of it as it's being played out in these different fields, and perhaps that can be distilled down to some common elements, like when the bankers, did you manage to get them talking? Did you manage to introduce this grammar to them in a way that those two sides could unite?
Yeah, it's interesting because we had a time limitation for that work, both in preparing and implementing. Your question is very real for me in that when we were very successful, we were thanked a lot, but it really would have been a lot better if we'd had the folks who speak a different grammar in the room with the siloed expertise in HR.
Yeah, I must point out that I've had a stroke, and the part of my brain that's been affected by the stroke is my location of words. So when I'm having a conversation, I'm struggling to find the words that I use to express myself. I still recognize things and I write okay at the moment, still at the moment, but in conversation I'm a little bit handicapped to fully express myself.
No need to apologize or explain. It's you did a great job.
May I jump in for a second? Because listening to the two of you, it makes me wonder now, because Nick, you're talking about like figuring out what's the vocabulary of solution focused in different applications, in different fields, in different domains, and that's my takeaway from what you're saying. So if I would put up the vocabulary, what would be the word that would be the basis of that vocabulary? And then, because how I see language is that it's structured with words that compose that vocabulary, and then the grammar comes on top, and the grammar being, in our case, this kind of tools, like you said, scaling questions, miracle question, or any other kind of, I don't know if I should call them tools, but things that we have, that would become for me the grammar. So I would start with the wording, and after that go with another layer of grammar. And if I listen to Alan, I think that the beautiful part of the project was actually leaving this aside, that it's called solution focused vocabulary and grammar, and saying, so what do I have in this organization? What do you use? What do you use? What do you use? I don't, I take my one out. I take out my vocabulary and my grammar, and I just work with what I have from the teams that are in front of me, and I design for them something that they can use as their common vocabulary and their common grammar.
And Richard's a good example of, he's got an expertise they don't have, website and marketing, communications, creative, and all this kind of stuff, that he still, you'll have noticed he's, as I said, he spends very little time talking about what the client's actually asking for, and talking more about the language of what works, etc., etc. That language that's particular to that engineering business. He would probably, if it's a different kind of client business, they make shoes or something like that, very different. The questions would probably be quite similar, but the responses would be a very different language, I'm thinking. A lot has to do with the expertise of the organization. Engineering firms, engineers, salespeople. Shoe firms, shoe manufacturers, very few shoe manufacturers, brands actually make the shoes themselves these days. They're made in China. So their competence is quite different. So each time you go into a client, assessing what their key competence is helps a lot in, again, figuring out what they actually want and having them tell you instead of you going away and guessing. When I was in advertising, the client would, and famous companies like Coca-Cola and Levi's, they would tell you what they want for the next campaign. You take it in a couple of weeks later and they go, that's not what we asked for. Because we didn't ask good questions. We just assumed the client knew exactly what they wanted. Well, they didn't.
So Nick, does that sort of answers your question or your need?
I think my quest is a ongoing one. I've got greater clarification as a result of these workshops at this conference.
One last thought for me on this topic is, I use the word narrative. Narrative therapy. The guy who trained me originally, Jim DeVal, to me, narrative and grammar have a lot in common. And maybe it's I don't know if it's a fancier word, but it's what I'm pitching to my clients. I'm not the expert in your business. What I'm going to do is help you reframe the narrative about where you want to get to and how you're going to get there and all this kind of stuff. Because in the therapy world, what we're often doing with complicated clients is taking them from hopeless to hopeful. Organizations are just the same. Quite often, they're feeling hopeless, they don't put it that way, and we're taking them to hopeful by reframing their narrative. And I'm sure there's some stuff in there about the grammar that we use, that we adjust it to each client's circumstances or whatever.
And I think, Nick,
Yeah.
there's a longer conversation, because if you want to look at all of the applications, like it was this example on marketing, I'm more than sure that there are all of this perspective of, you know, like we had now the topic of education, like when you look at coaching and when you look at NGOs and how do they use them to reach the same result at the end of the day. So there's probably, you're right, there's a very big quest in there to collect all of those pieces of grammar, but also vocabulary.
Right. And the rest of our audience, this lady who's been facilitating me, Cristina, is 1 o'clock in the morning. And she's been up late most nights. So on behalf of the sympathetic audience here, empathetic, what would you like to say in finishing, other than it's been a great pleasure?
Well, it's been a great pleasure, because you know what I truly enjoyed out of the session was that we did not keep it to a script. We just tried to figure it out what would be useful and what do we take, or each individual out of this conversation takes. And right. I think that was, for me, the fact that we were fine with just going off the script and saying, this is the group that we have in front of us, and we work with what we have and we work with what we get. And by having a conversation like with Nick now, by saying, so this is what I'm trying to achieve, and taking those, what is he talking about? What are you talking about? And then there was, again, this beautiful conversation about building alliances, and looking back into everything that we went through in the session. I think I can only be grateful for having the chance to think about them. Because, you know, if we give ourselves the time to think about all of this kind of like small topics, even from the outside, you just go like, yeah, of course, just it's a social change, so it takes a lot of time. You have to go through some changes in the legislation, all good. We know, we heard about it. But if you pause and if you look at it into details and you question and think about it, then other things evolve and emerge. So what was your takeaway out of this?
Phenomenal. Nick, you're probably younger than me. I'm 72.
So am I.
But, you know, 20 years ago, going to maybe more than 20 years, going to a solution-focused 2-day training for family therapists, and to find where I am today, it's, I don't know how gratifying. It's nothing to do with I'm really good at it. It's what you can do with it, and the impact it has on people's lives is just amazing. So, Cristina, go and hug your kids, say goodnight to them, and thank you everybody for attending.
They're all asleep. And Nick, please do let us know when you put up something together, because I would really, really love to read that.
Yeah.
And do reach out if you have any other topics that we can debate upon. This has been wonderful. Thank you so much. If anyone wants to say any other final words, please open your mics and now you have a chance.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.